going on, everybody? Welcome on into this FanDuel Facebook Live Waiver Wire Q&A as we get set for most likely the fantasy football semifinals this weekend, getting you set with those waiver wires so you can add those guys for those critical matchups this weekend. My name is Jim Sannes. I am a senior writer and analyst for NumberFire.com, joined here as always by JJ Zachariason. He is the editor-in-chief of NumberFire and FanDuel. JJ, it is the fantasy football semifinals in most leagues. How you doing today?
I'm good. Fortunately, have some teams that are still alive. Had a lot of tilting last night with Miles Sanders and his cramping, but we're on to week 15. I'm pushing it aside. I'm done with it. I'm excited for week 15.
We are on to Cincinnati, and it's definitely an interesting week this week because it was unfortunate in week 14 that a lot of playoff matches probably swung based on injuries. Specifically, we had Calvin Ridley go down and Mike Evans as well. Mike Evans is a big one. He did get that touchdown, but now we head into week 15 and Evans has been so good this year. There are probably a lot of managers who had Evans on their team who are looking for replacements out there on the waiver wire. Mike Evans not being there also impacts Jameis Winston in a pretty major way too. So JJ, before we get into the questions over on Facebook Live, and if you want to ask questions about your waivers, make sure you send those over on Facebook Live. We'll get to as many as we can for today. But before we get there, what's the big fallout here from Mike Evans going down for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, both for Winston and the rest of their pass catchers?
Yeah, it sucks because they had a pretty favorable week 15 and 16 for Jameis Winston. And obviously, I would argue strongly that this hurts Chris Godwin too because he's going to end up seeing tighter coverage. I mean, Darius Slay, I know that Chris Godwin will play in the slot a lot, but Slay will go to the slot and he can shadow Chris Godwin, whereas before he would have been shadowing Mike Evans, which would have opened up a lot of volume and potential for Chris Godwin in that matchup. So it hurts Chris Godwin, definitely hurts Jameis Winston as well. And then the guys that are kind of benefiting from this injury would be, Justin Watson ended up seeing, I think, 8 targets in that game. But then there's also Brashad Perriman, who kind of fits more of the mold, in my opinion, of what Mike Evans does for that team, which is play on the perimeter and get down the field. He's obviously not as good as Mike Evans, but Brashad Perriman to me is probably the guy that I would be targeting most off the waiver wire this week. He played the most snaps outside of the two guys. He has consistently throughout the season. And then Scotty Miller's was banged up. He wasn't playing that game. And that's also helped Justin Watson do what he did. Watson's an interesting prospect though. He's a really athletic guy. I think he went to Penn, I want to say, but really athletic guy, had a lot of production, obviously, at a smaller school. So he's pretty intriguing. I just think that the safer option off the waiver wire this week is Brashad Perriman.
And the thing about Watson, too, is that he's not some guy off the street. He was a 5th-round pick, which means that, people recognize the fact that he had talent. And I think that we saw that after Mike Evans went down, he actually led the team with 8 targets. And Perriman, I think, had 4 in that time. Chris Godwin had 7. O.J. Howard had 5, which makes Watson interesting. However, you mentioned Scotty Miller. We don't know if Scotty Miller's going to play here because we were talking on Tuesday. Would you have faith in either Perriman or Watson if you add Scotty Miller into that equation? Because Miller was playing a decent number of snaps earlier this year. Would the situation be too foggy for you to trust it if Miller can play?
I mean, I think of the 3, Perriman would still be my go-to if I were desperate. I mean, I think that Perriman is probably going to walk into that matchup and realistically, it's a great matchup for Brashad Perriman. He's going to play on the outside, and if Slay does end up shadowing Chris Godwin, and all of a sudden Perriman's a very usable asset just because of the matchup, and given the fact that Tampa Bay, we know, is a pretty pass-friendly team. So I think that he's viable as maybe a wide receiver 4 if you're really desperate. But I think that's kind of the max and how you should be viewing these guys because we don't know exactly what the target distribution is going to look like. And then Chris Godwin's just going to be, Chris Godwin. I would still expect him to be a fringe wide receiver 1. But I think that ceiling was much, much higher with a healthy Mike Evans.
Right, because Mike Evans helps move the ball, which leads to more touchdown chances. And if they have fewer touchdown chances, that's how you get a lower ceiling for Chris Godwin. So I would definitely be wary of Godwin for, upping him too much. And also Jameis Winston does get negatively impacted here, even though we're not going to Jameis Winston for efficiency by any means. Jeremy East is asking over on Facebook Live, any hidden gems out there? One guy you mentioned in 15 transactions today, JJ, is Patrick Laird. And if you are on Daily Fantasy Twitter, you know Patrick Laird, but the season-long players may not know who Patrick Laird is. He is a running back for the Dolphins, been getting pretty good work recently. He's a pass catching back. Is Patrick Laird someone you would consider a kind of hidden gem out there on the wire you could use this week?
I would say versus expectation, probably. Yeah, I mean, it's a plus matchup. That game's kind of intriguing for anyone involved just because the defenses haven't been very good. And Laird really saw an uptick in work this past week. Over the last 2 weeks, he's seen an uptick in snaps. In week 13, his snap share is 59.7%. This past week, it was up to 81.9%. He scored 12.6 PPR points this past week. He's given us a top 20 performance in both weeks, which is not easy to do in that Miami backfield. And actually, he's the only Miami running back to be able to do that this season. So Patrick Laird, I think, is a very high floor option who should see a decent amount of looks through the air, which is key. You know, Devontae Parker had that concussion, so we don't know what the status is there. So if Devontae Parker's not there, then all of a sudden there's even more volume that's freed up. They might dump it down to or check it down to Patrick Laird. So I think he's viable this week. I think he's sort of a low end RB2 in PPR formats.
Yeah, he's had 5 targets each of the past 2 weeks. And in one of those games, Kalen Ballage did play. Kalen Ballage now on IR, which opens up higher odds that he gets those 5 targets. But I think that's definitely something at this point in the year where if you need a replacement, Patrick Laird can certainly be that guy. Jeffrey Taffer is asking, sticking with the Dolphins, Fitzpatrick is on the wire. Is he worth a stream this week? I have been riding Josh Allen and am scared. Josh Allen is on the road facing the Steelers in a game with a crazy low total. So would you go with Ryan Fitzpatrick or would you stick with Josh Allen in that scenario?
I mean, I think that you should go with Ryan Fitzpatrick. It sounds crazy, but if that's especially true if Devontae Parker is able to play. But Josh Allen this past week only scores 10 fantasy points. The matchup against Baltimore was in Buffalo. Baltimore is playing probably better defense than Pittsburgh overall over the last 5 or 6 weeks. But Pittsburgh's obviously got one of the best defenses in the league as well. And they're playing in Pittsburgh. I just think that game could get ugly in general. Whereas the Miami game could be, at least somewhat intriguing from a fantasy perspective because the defenses suck. But with Ryan Fitzpatrick too, we saw a lot of rushing upside with him this past week, which is exactly what you get with Josh Allen. But Ryan Fitzpatrick without Devontae Parker there, he ended up for at least most of the game. He ended up running the ball for 65 yards. So we know that upside's there. And it's a plus matchup. I think Ryan Fitzpatrick is at least a safer option than Josh Allen at this point. I'm worried about Allen's upside just given the matchups. And we've seen him, be a consistent top 5 quarterback, Josh Allen this season, but he's also done so in some pretty plus matchups. And I'm a little bit worried about this Baltimore, Pittsburgh, New England final. I actually think that he's droppable at this point.
Yeah. Josh Allen against tough teams has been a very different player than Josh Allen against not good teams. He's faced a lot of not good teams so far this year. And Ryan Fitzpatrick, potentially, maybe he should have been playing above Kalen Ballage at running back earlier this year. We'll see. I don't know about that. But regardless, I think that Fitzpatrick would be the way to go, potentially even if Devontae Parker can't go. Bob Benedict is asking, he lost Calvin Ridley. Any advice on his replacement? Now, we talked about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receivers. There is some ambiguity there. So any other wide receivers on the wire this week, broadly, JJ, who you think could step in if someone lost Calvin Ridley?
Yeah, I mean, if A.J. Brown's out there, he's definitely someone that you would want to add. Since Ryan Tannehill took over in Week 7, not only have the Titans been awesome, only 5 teams have averaged more yards per drive. Only the Ravens are scoring at a higher rate per drive. But A.J. Brown has seen a 22% target share. He's averaging over 14 PPR points per game. He's been a low-end wide receiver, too, essentially, since Ryan Tannehill took over. So I think A.J. Brown's the obvious go-to in that scenario. If you're looking at the Atlanta offense in general, I probably wouldn't be adding anyone outside of, maybe Russell Gage, just because he had that role in the slot, and he's had that role in the slot, and he's been a sort of a high floor performer. But I'm just not that intrigued by the passing attack without Calvin Ridley, so I'm not really buying into that Atlanta passing attack. And then the other guy, you just have to see what's going on with DJ Chark. But DJ Chark was seen in a protective boot after their game. And he also apparently left the locker room in a scooter. That was what the report said. So I don't think that's good news for someone like DJ Chark. They're in a plus matchup this week. And I think Chris Conley, as a result, would see an uptick in volume. At least he gives you more of a floor. Now, Chris Conley splits with Gardner Minshew and Nick Foles have been kind of interesting. I would probably prefer him a little bit more with Nick Foles. But I still think that Conley's fine in a plus matchup, especially if DJ Chark doesn't go. I'd say that Chris Conley's probably a high-end wide receiver 3, or at least a mid wide receiver 3.
Yeah, DJ Chark and a scooter might have a higher average depth of target than DD Westbrook. So there's still that. Yes. John Gennis is asking, Evans going out stinks. My only backup wide receiver is Brandon Cooks. Would you pick up and start Randall Cobb, Larry Fitzgerald, Chris Conley, or one of the Bucs wide receivers over Brandon Cooks? Last week, Brandon Cooks didn't play a lot of snaps for the Rams. Neither did Cooper Kupp. Would you trust Brandon Cooks, or would you go with one of those waiver wire wide receivers?
I'm not trusting Brandon Cooks at this point. He has 24 yards over the last 2 weeks. He has 4 targets. And mind you, this is when the Rams have been moving the football. I mean, they've been good offensively. They sort of changed their identity a bit, and they've played a little bit more 2 tight end sets. That's pushed out Cooper Kupp especially, but Brandon Cooks also to a degree. They just haven't been used as much. And Robert Woods has really benefited from it. But I'm not buying into Brandon Cooks. He's actually droppable because in week 16, then they get San Francisco, and that's going to be really tough to trust. So even if Brandon Cooks has a big game this week, which I don't think is likely, I don't think that you're going to end up playing him in week 16 anyway. So you can just drop him. You can just drop him straight up from one of those guys. I'd probably take any of them over Brandon Cooks at this point.
I wouldn't blame you. I've always been a huge Brandon Cooks guy, but in that game, for the Rams, you saw Sean McVay yelling at Brandon Cooks for the route that he ran on an interception that Jared Goff threw, and it's probably not a coincidence that occurred in a game where his snap rate dropped. So I think it would be very, very hard to trust Brandon Cooks as of right now. Christopher Ponzica is asking, what to do with Josh Jacobs? Would you pick up Boston Scott or DeAndre Washington? So that sounds like a person who has Josh Jacobs, may need to fill in this week. Would you pick up Boston Scott or would you pick up DeAndre Washington?
I think this one's easy. I think it's DeAndre Washington. I don't even care about matchups in this case either, because Boston Scott, what if Jordan Howard does come back this week? Then that obviously muddies that situation. But Miles Sanders, Boston Scott got going a little bit last night. I'm trying not to tilt all over again, but he got going a little bit last night because Miles Sanders had cramps. Left the game, went to the locker room, and then the drive where they ended up scoring a rushing touchdown, Boston Scott was the one that was active and on the field. I just don't think that Boston Scott's going to see a massive workload week in and week out. And if you have Josh Jacobs, if Josh Jacobs plays, you have to play Josh Jacobs. But then on top of that, with DeAndre Washington, when he stepped in last week, he had a 23% target share in that Oakland offense, which is actually way higher than what Josh Jacobs has seen all season long. So DeAndre Washington, really highly used in that offense and utilized. So if you have Josh Jacobs, you can easily just fall back on Washington if Jacobs does end up going.
His snap rate was higher than Josh Jacobs usually was too. So
yeah,
it was
crazy.
It was wild. So for some reason, they're more willing to use him, probably because of the shoulder injury for Jacobs, but that was very interesting for sure. Mike Swingle is asking, do I pick up Ian Thomas or Tyler Higbee? And would I sit Kyle Rudolph and Jack Doyle over that pickup? I think that Jack Doyle is actually still a pretty interesting guy. I know that he didn't do a whole lot this past week in a plus matchup, but doesn't seem like T.Y. Hilton's going to go. Would you use a streamer like Ian Thomas or Higbee over Rudolph and Doyle?
It's close. I think that Rudolph actually might be the worst of the 4 options this week, because Adam Thielen might be back. We don't really know. It seems like he should have been back like 6 weeks ago, but he wasn't. But Kyle Rudolph, it's not. He's fine, and he's been great without Adam Thielen. But if Thielen's back, then Rudolph is not in the picture. But if you look at the other 3 tight ends, I think Jack Doyle has a really high floor week in and week out, just given the other options in that offense. They had good wide receiver matchups last week. It was a good tight end matchup too. But when you have these good wide receiver matchups, it can often, you're going to force the ball to those wide receivers. Tyler Higbee has been utilized a lot over the last 2 weeks. I do think that there's one caveat that needs to be thrown out there. He's faced the 2 worst teams by far at stopping tight ends. It was Arizona 2 weeks ago, which they've been horrendous. But when you adjust for strength of opponent, Seattle's actually not that far behind at stopping the tight end position. So I do like Higbee this week because it's not like Dallas is that unfavorable of a matchup, and it's a high-scoring game, or should be a fairly high-scoring game. So I don't mind Higbee, but I do think that caveat needs to be said. And then Ian Thomas is facing that Seattle team this week, so I think he's a great streamer as well. I can make the argument, at least make the argument, that Ian Thomas and Tyler Higbee should be started over Jack Doyle, but I do think that Doyle is probably the safest option that you can find, just given a high target floor.
Yeah, Ian Thomas had a really good week last week. And like you said, he's got a great matchup this week. So if Greg Olsen can't go, definitely intriguing. There's a little bit of yardage upside with Ian Thomas too, which I think is intriguing because he's a very good athlete. So they're both viable options to have. So you could be in a very much worse spot. But I'd agree that Rudolph is below all of them to me. Nick Peterson is asking thoughts on Kamara in the playoffs. We saw the biggest dud that Alvin Kamara has had probably ever, I would say, is like a fantasy asset this past week. But the usage was still there. So what are your thoughts on Alvin Kamara as we get into the fantasy playoffs?
I mean, you can't bench him, right? I mean, it's where, not only is the running back landscape not very great, but Alvin Kamara is still seeing some usage, decent usage, and he's still seeing, decent target share numbers. So I think that you can continue to ride him. I'm just shocked and very proud of this list, of this viewer, for making it to the semifinals with Alvin Kamara.
That's very true. 4.3 points and 8.5 PPR settings was not great. So congrats, Nick, on making it there. Gary Fass is asking, any good defenses to stream? And then he asks Kansas City. Kansas City is at home. They're pretty big favorites. They're facing Denver. Drew Lock has looked really good, but he can be erratic. I love Drew Lock, but the dude can be pretty volatile. So is KC a defense you would target? If not, what other defenses stand out to you?
I really like Kansas City this week. I mentioned Detroit on my 15 transaction show, but that was just more of a deeper play if you're really desperate. I think Kansas City is the best normal streamer this week. If you look at what's gone on with Drew Lock over his first two starts, his Chargers game, they see a positive game script, but it's not like that offense. It's not like the Broncos offense really moved the ball that well. And then they face Houston this past week, which Houston's defense just looked not right that entire game, at least not even close to what they looked like against New England the previous week. So it's kind of hard to just look at this 2-game sample and say this Denver Broncos offense is not one that you want to stream against. Whereas you look at the Kansas City defense, they're much better when playing at home historically and this year, much better at playing at home. It's really not that bad of a defense in general. The secondary is a lot better than people give it credit for. Their rush defense is a little bit of a concern because you're playing an offense that can run the football. But I think that they're a pretty safe option given the fact that they're really heavy favorites and they're playing at home.
And Kansas City is, once you adjust for schedules, actually ranked 5th against the pass based on number of fires metrics. I know it's not perception, but they basically sell out so much to stop the pass. That's why they're so bad against the rush. But it allows them to be better against the pass. And I think that is impactful. Yeah, exactly. That's the way you should do it. Maybe not to the extent that they do it. Right. I want to devote a couple guys to stopping the run, but it's worked out. And I think that does make them a really good defense for this week. Matt Palmer is asking, is it worth picking up Njoku or Higbee to play over Gesicki and Goddard? So a kind of similar question. David Njoku's snap rate last week really low, about 37%, but we like Higbee a little bit. Would you use him over Gesicki or Goddard?
I think Gesicki is still interesting. I know he had a down game this past week, but it's not the best matchup in the world from a tight end stopping standpoint, but it's not horrible either. I think Gesicki is still going to see a decent amount of looks. I'm not really, David Njoku is someone that I wrote up in my 15 transactions column, and I talked about him on my podcast. And the way that I kind of view Njoku this week is you have to read reports and see what people are saying about his usage because he only ran 9 routes this past week. So it's really hard to trust that whenever you have viable options like a Mike Gesicki or a Tyler Higbee. I can make the argument for either of those guys, I would say, over Njoku. I would put them above Njoku. But as of right now, I think I might lean Gesicki. But I could probably... It's basically 50-50 between him and Tyler Higbee. Yeah,
it's close. And again, you have options. And I think that you could do a lot worse. So kind of get a read on Njoku for sure, because obviously we want that matchup. But based on the way things went last week, it'd be really hard for there to be a level of trust there. Got a question both on YouTube from Brandon Cirulli and then one from Derek Bjork over on Facebook Live, asking about Raheem Mostert. Derek wanted to prioritize between A.J. Brown, Raheem Mostert, and Patrick Laird on waivers. But also, I just want your broad thoughts on Raheem Mostert because we saw Matt Breida come back last week. And even with that, Mostert still played 60% of the snaps. He had that long touchdown on that gadget play from Emmanuel Sanders. 10 carries and 2 targets, not the best volume, but that snap rate's not bad. And they're big favorites against Atlanta. So what are your thoughts on Raheem Mostert this week? And I'll ask you the other question after that.
I think you got to probably view him as like an RB2, lower end RB2. I would probably put him ahead of Laird. I think Laird's probably a little bit safer, only as crazy as that sounds, only because we know that the usage is likely to be there. He's going to play a higher snap rate. But I trust San Francisco to be able to see a positive game script and score more points. So I like Mostert. Like you said, he's basically playing the Tevin Coleman role that Coleman was playing earlier this season. And even with Matt Breida basically hurt Tevin Coleman more than he hurt Raheem Mostert coming back this past week. But there is the Tevin Coleman narrative this week of playing against his old team.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah,
that's true. Kyle Shanahan and Tevin Coleman.
Yeah, revenge game narrative. I couldn't think of the word revenge whenever I was saying that. But yeah, revenge game narrative for Tevin Coleman. But I still think Mostert is a pretty strong play.
San Francisco had no chance to beat Atlanta until we remember the revenge game. Otherwise, we would have favored Atlanta there for sure.
Right.
So if you had to prioritize, and we like all these guys, between AJ Brown and Raheem Mostert and Patrick Laird, how would you rank those three guys as ads? And let's assume that the need at wide receiver, running back is pretty equal for this team.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say, Jim. I was going to say that if they needed a running back, then just go with Mostert. If you need a wide receiver, just go with AJ Brown. I would say. If it's a PPR league and if you know that your opponents, look at your opponents' needs too.
Yeah.
I think that the smartest move is probably to get AJ Brown right now, because they have a soft schedule and because that backfield for San Francisco can be pretty fickle. I don't think Patrick Laird is as good of an ad as Raheem Mostert. I think that he's fine and he's good, and that's why he was in the column this week. But I'd probably go AJ Brown, Mostert, and then Laird.
And we know that A.J. Brown's going to be on the field. I think that the odds of that are higher than Raheem Mostert. Like his projected snap rate is higher, and that is valuable because it's hard to score fantasy points when you're not on the field. Nick Stevens is asking, I have Dak and Baker. Would you trust them, or should I pick up Ryan Fitzpatrick? Personally, I like Dak and Baker. The problem is I like Dak and Baker every week, and it doesn't always work out. So if you have those two guys, would you go with Ryan Fitzpatrick, or would you use one of them?
Baker's in the best matchup or one of the best matchups that you can find this week, but after seeing him perform last week, it's just really tough to trust. I really wish, I have a league where I have Drew Brees and Baker Mayfield. I picked up Baker last week because I had a bye, and I'm thinking to myself, I'll just play Baker against Arizona because Brees has been iffy, and then Brees comes out and does what he did last week. Now I have to play Drew Brees after that. That's kind of, the ups and downs of fantasy football is that Baker Mayfield objectively should probably be a fringe top 10 quarterback this week ranked. And I saw him ranked as like QB 15 or so this week, which I think is a little bit too low. But I think Dak is still the play. If you look at what Dak's done when you adjust for strength of opponent, Dallas's quarterbacks in general, if you just go by team quarterback, Dallas ranks, I think, third in the league right now, or maybe even second. I think it's Baltimore, then Houston, then Dallas. In quarterback points scored, adjust for strength of opponent. I think Dak is pretty safe. There's a high over under. It's already moving, as you mentioned before we started the show. That line is already moving up to be higher scoring. I don't mind Ryan Fitzpatrick. I would also feel a lot better about Ryan Fitzpatrick this week if we knew for sure that Devontae Parker was going to play, because I think that did affect him last week with Parker going out in the second quarter. So I would go Dak there. I actually think I'd play Baker over Ryan Fitzpatrick as well.
Yeah, I would rank those two higher as well. And I think that with Dak, it's important to remember, too, the Cowboys have pretty significant home road splits, and they're at home this week. And I view Dak as, like, there aren't a lot of quarterbacks who are matchup proof in fantasy. Yeah. Dak is very close to that when he is at home. And I think that I would feel good about him. Another question about Dak from Bethany Peters asking, should I play Dak or pick up Ryan Tannehill? Tannehill is also at home. He is facing Houston. That total, for some reason, is higher. It's at 50 points. Whereas the Rams-Cowboys one is at 49. Would you pick up Tannehill and play him over Dak, or would you ride it Dak?
This is I feel like this is impossible to answer. Like, this is one of the hardest questions I feel like anyone's ever asked on the show. I don't know right now. And I know, Bethany, you can hit me up on Twitter, because I know that you hit me up on Twitter and stuff, and we can talk about it later in the week. Maybe I'll have some more clarity. My fear with Ryan Tannehill, I like the matchup for Tannehill more. My fear with Tannehill is that we've seen, first off, Houston hasn't been able to stop the run very well. And they could just lean on Derrick Henry even more than usual, even though Derrick Henry's a little bit banged up. But my fear with Tannehill is that he's been so efficient, and there's probably going to be at least some regression coming from that perspective. So if he throws the ball 20 to 25 times, it's really easy to see how Ryan Tannehill could score single-digit fantasy points. Whereas I trust Dak Prescott's rushing floor and really passing ability more than I do Ryan Tannehill's. So I think I might lean Dak right now, but it's not an easy thing. It's a straight up 50-50 thing thing right now.
There's a very real chance Ryan Tannehill throws the ball 15 times here, and I think that's worth accounting for. So, like, from a floor perspective, Ryan Tannehill's probably good because his efficiency's been good, but, like, Dak's ceiling's pretty good, too.
Yeah.
John Moretti is asking, can I trust Leonard Fournette? The Jaguars kind of given up. Like, they've gone full Louisville on us, Louisville from 2018. Can you trust Leonard Fournette on the road against Oakland as a 5.5-point underdog?
I mean, yeah, I think so. There's probably very few running backs that you can play over Leonard Fournette. I mean, he's still a top 10 running back this week, so I would say yes.
And even though he got benched in the fourth, they were resting him in the fourth quarter.
They're down by like 85 points.
Right.
So
Despite that, he still got good usage in that game. So, like, even if they get blown out again, he'll probably still have enough to not be a dud for you. Chuck Schwader is asking, Cooper or Robinson? This is Amari Cooper or Allen Robinson. I have Dak. Should I pick up trivially? I actually don't know what that means. So we're going to skip that one. Michael Zarelli, is Robbie Anderson too much of a risk against Baltimore? We usually don't do start-sit questions here, but because that is a Thursday game, we can discuss that one here. Robbie Anderson facing Baltimore. He's been getting really good volume recently, but Baltimore's defense legit. The Jets offense probably isn't. What do you see with Robbie there?
Yeah, I think most Jets players are droppable. I don't think you can drop Le'Veon Bell just because it's hard to get running back usage off the waiver wire. But, we've seen sort of this back and forth movement with the Jets wide receivers since Sam Darnold's come back from mono, where, Jamison Crowder was this really effective wide receiver for fantasy for 3 straight weeks. And then it started to swing towards Robbie Anderson. Then over the last few weeks, it's been Robbie Anderson, who's seen, I think, like a 21-ish or 22% target share over the last few weeks. So if I were to choose one of those guys in the offense, it would probably end up being Robbie. But I don't think you can trust them as anything better than a low-end wide receiver 3 this week.
The potential for ghosts is quite high in that game. The Jets have been fluky in good matchups, and they've been very bad in bad matchups, so it's a tough spot there for sure. Sean T. Pichette is asking, Bears defense or Kansas City? The Bears defense is on the road and facing the Packers. I'm assuming we lean Kansas City here?
Yeah, I think I'd go Kansas City. It's just, it's tough. Aaron Rodgers doesn't like to turn the ball over. I think Kansas City is the play.
All right. Jerry Nelson is asking, I have Kirk Cousins. Should I start him or pick up Ryan Tannehill? It's another Ryan Tannehill question here. The Vikings are on the road in air quotes, against the Chargers. Would you use Cousins or Tannehill there?
That one's easy. I think it's Ryan Tannehill. There's more scoring potential. The Chargers secondary and defense is not bad. I mean, it's not an easy matchup, especially when you adjust for strength of opponent. The Chargers have been really good against both wide receivers and pretty good against quarterbacks. So I think that one's pretty easy. I'd go with Tannehill.
And they just got Adrian Phillips and Derwin James back. And those are like 2 very, very good players. You saw what they did to the Jaguars last week. They held future Hall of Famer Drew Lock to like 138 yards. So, they're a great defense once again. Tony Jacobs, will any studs see a reduced role this week? This is the time of year where motivation starts to creep in, but we haven't seen any real reason for us to expect studs to see reduced usage. We did see that a bit with Leonard Fournette this past week, but that was because they were getting wiped. Any read on guys who may see decreased usage? Because I don't think that's necessarily in play just yet, on my end at least.
I don't think it is either. I was maybe a little bit concerned to see what the new regime for Carolina would do with Christian McCaffrey. But obviously, if you look at his market share numbers last week, I know he wasn't amazing for fantasy purposes, but if you look at his market share numbers last week, his usage was pretty similar to what we've seen throughout the season. So I'm not that concerned. If you're playing in week 17 in fantasy football, if your championship, it's like a 2-week championship or it's a single week championship in week 17 for whatever reason, number one, quit the league. Number two, that's when you definitely have to be a little bit worried. I'm actually a little bit concerned about next week with Baltimore, because there is a chance that they've just locked things up because they had the tiebreaker against New England. But even still, I'm not overly concerned about it.
Yeah, and with Christian McCaffrey, they're also chasing a yards from scrimmage record, which is something to keep track of with CJ2K holding that record. So that could motivate them to keep on using him there. Bethany Peters asks, Trubisky versus Baker. Baker facing Arizona. Trubisky looked better. He's been running more recently too, but he's on the road against the Packers. Is that a spot where you go with Baker or would you go Trubisky?
I would go with Baker there. Trubisky's not a bad play. I think that he's a little bit undervalued. He was someone that I featured in my column this week as well. He's been running the ball more. He's averaged 7 rush attempts over his last 3 games. He's had about 28, I think, rushing yards per game over that time. Because they're kind of letting him go and not be a game manager anymore, which is good to see because that's not the kind of quarterback that Mitch Trubisky is. So I don't mind Trubisky in that spot. I think that he's, kind of a mid to lower end QB2, but probably higher than consensus. But I think Baker's a legit option to be a low end QB1 this week.
All right. 2 quick questions. We have Julio Jones. Thoughts on him this week, given the tough matchup with San Fran?
I still think you have to play Julio.
I would agree with that. And then finally, Ryan O'Connell, Kansas City defense or Green Bay defense? Green Bay is facing the Bears. So the flip side of that other equation, would you go with them over the Chiefs or ride with the Chiefs as big home favorites?
Man, I don't know. Do you have a preference there? Can I opt to go to Jim?
I would probably go with Kansas City. Personally.
Yeah, I think Kansas City.
Like, again, I love Drew Lock, but I think that Kansas City, good defense, at home, big favorites. They just check all of them.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think I was sort of leaning Kansas City's way. And with Trubisky playing a little bit better, I think that's probably the play. Yeah.
All right. That is all the time that we have for today. Appreciate all the questions that you had, but we didn't get to your question. Do not fret. JJ is back with you on Sunday to answer all your start sit questions right here at noon. Just a couple of weeks left for that. So make sure you take advantage. JJ, what do you have going on the rest of this week over at the Late Round Podcast?
Yeah, the typical stuff. So 15 transactions went out today. Tomorrow will be the 10 trends show, and then the matchup show, and then the mailbag show on Friday. Only 2 weeks left, though, of the Late Round Podcast until the end of the season. So hopefully it helps you kind of get over the hump and win that fantasy championship.
Absolutely. So find that by searching for the Late Round Podcast. Also find JJ on Twitter at Late Round QB. I am at Jim Sannes, JIMSANNES. Regular podcast schedule for this week for the Heat Check Fantasy Podcast. Our recap went up yesterday. Preview goes up on Thursday, breaking down Week 15 on the main slate from a DFS perspective. You can also follow the FanDuel Podcast Network on Twitter at FanDuel Podcast. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald, our video producer, for running the switches for today. As always, thank you, Cal, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. Congratulations for making it this far in the fantasy playoffs. Good luck with your waivers and good luck in Week 15. And hopefully, we'll talk to you once again next week for those championship lineups. This has been the FanDuel Waiver Wire Q&A here on Facebook Live and YouTube.